Tout d'abord, excusez-nous un petit peu pour ce retard.
We're sorry, we're a bit late. That's true, we'd like to apologize. But that's true, you know, we were thinking about how we organize these 2 days. These are very important moments, which is always the case for our symposium. And we didn't keep an eye on the clock. Now, we're going to start with the afternoon meeting. We will be talking mainly about other figures and narratives in installations and settlements. This is a pivotal theme, and I think that we all know how important the narratives are, and the question of images as well, and the imaginary as well. This is some type of material for architects to produce either buildings or cities or landscapes or territories. And these, as you know, are all the underlying themes in the fabric of inhabited places. We will be listening to 3 speakers, Suzanne Stacher, Philippe Simet from Agence Base, before we end our afternoon session. So by way of introduction, I have tried a number of things for this introduction, and I thought I would look first at the narratives and the underlying plots, which are very much discussed in schools of architecture. And I thought that I would start with philosophy. And I therefore asked the speakers to introduce themselves. Well, you know who they are if you have the booklet with you. But the question I asked them is, what are your passions? What are your commitments or engagement? What really matters to you? Rather than saying, you know, I'm Suzanne Stacher, I'm an architect, I lecture as well at the École Nationale Supérieure d'Architecture in the town of Versailles, and also a critique. But what I'd like to know is how Suzanne would like to describe herself in a different manner, and the inner driving forces that she has. And to get started with the afternoon session, I'd like to start with a couple of things. First, a sentence from a philosopher, a sentence that was reused by Benoît Goethe in his research work, and that's from Martin Lubert, who wrote a book called Le problème de l'homme. Homme meaning human beings in this case. And this is what he said. What's very interesting is to see to what extent, as Benoît Goethe said in this splendid book called Théorie des maisons, the theory of houses, that Martin Buber revisited the human spirit. He revisited the history of human spirit. And at a time when we talk about the living and life, the question of the spirit is something essential that underlies all the narratives. Here's the sentence that I'd like to quote, because you will see this sentence brings us to how we can imagine worlds, not just one world. Of course, we have a common world, which is the Gaia, the earth that we all share, but also to conjure up places. The question of places also is some type of material for our narrative. I'd like to therefore use these 2 forms of expression, these 2 views. Martin Buber to start with. And when he was lecturing at the Jerusalem University in 1938, just before the war, came up with this sentence that he coined that I think is quite interesting, that was commented by Benoît Goethe. In the history of human spirit, I make a difference between different periods of time when human beings were owning their own homes and other moments when they were homeless. In the former, they're living as if they were living in a house, and in the latter, they were living like living in the fields, and sometimes they wouldn't even have the 4 piles that are necessary to have a tent. End of quote. That's Martin Buber's quote on Le Problème de l'Homme, and this is connected to the saga of human beings, from being nomadic to being sedentary, and to have a house or home. That's a very important question as well, and in the light of what we're going to talk about. And in the history of philosophy, one of the main moments in philosophy is the settlements, a house where you can live, with Aristotle. Aristotle decided that what he would really discuss, the focus of his discussion, would be physis, nature, what is growing, what is stemming, because this is very much connected to the world of plants more than animals. Growing is different from personal development, for instance, in French, grandir. And the idea is that, well, in this history of ideas of Aristotle, he produced the conditions of a common narrative that would be used in many countries and languages. We know how important Aristotle was, as well as the Arab philosophers who reused Aristotle's writings. So this idea, which was a science, how we relate to the world, was pivotal again. This is again a narrative of the world and the meeting point between nature and culture, nature and philosophy, that we have in Aristotle's works. Sometimes, as you can see, in a couple of sentences, in the physics of Aristotle, we are looking at the very questions that we're discussing today. And now, if we were to talk about Plato, we all know that Plato was thinking about a world of ideas, and he was producing this splendid house or home, which was not on Earth. It was a speculative home in the world of ideas, a world which was not the world that we described this morning, a world of instability, as if through language and through the power of the mind, the question of stability could be rebuilt differently with words, with the discussions between human beings. And I think what's very important is this discussion we're having about having a home or a house that's stable or not, and how philosophies always try to reinstall some type of stability. Usually, Daniel Payot, for instance, who was a great friend of the Réseau Philo and Gerfo, worked on philosophy and architecture as a metaphor, the possibility of building arguments that make sense, that are intercorrelated, and that help you demonstrate your point. But the metaphor's changing, I think. These are the questions I wanted to put to you. We're going to listen to our guest speakers who are going to lecture on that, and we'll see what it means to have a house or 4 piles for a tent, or to have a home. And the second word in my introduction is on the 15th of May 2021 an article in Le Monde by Jean-Marie Gustave Leclésio, who entitled this article, I don't know if you've read it, by the way, but if you haven't, you should, The Rich and Polluting Countries. Will they be thinking about the people of Thule trying to escape the floods during the COP 2026? And this is very much what follows this discussion we had when we talked about the world of giants. Jean-Marie Gustave Leclésio started saying from the 1st to the 12th of November, during the 26th Global Conference on Climate in Glasgow, in Scotland, people will be talking about global warming and the floods, the rising of waters and oceans, and the appalling consequences on the pelagic populations in the world. We'll be talking about this with conviction. We'll say how important we have to take measures to reduce greenhouse gases, to reduce produce this increase in temperatures that seems to be unavoidable. We'll talk about the future and for the decades to come, and maybe until the end of the century. Yet there is a people for which this disaster has already started. The Cunas Indians from the archipelago of San Blas in the Atlantic coast of Panama. As we're speaking, the Cunas have to go away. They've been on this island forever due to the fact that the sea is rising. It's not due to a tropical storm, which was the case in Louisiana or Florida. This is a slow rise, a progressive rise, something very smooth and therefore very much frightening each day. The sea goes into the villages and floods everything, homes and squares. Inhabitants have to escape from the sea. They have to go on the pirogues or canoes and take their cows, personal belongings, cats and dogs and go away. But where? The Panama coast is not far away, but that's another world that the Kuna have not seen before very much, except to produce water, to hunt and to take medicinal plants. The forest is very difficult to live in with mosquitoes and animals. And there are many islands as well along the coast. People say that there are more than 300 islands where they settled several thousands of years ago. In the 1920s, the Cunas were the first indigenous peoples to proclaim their independence. They were fighting with weapons to rebuild the Thule Republic, which is their real name, a federation of families that each had its political council, moral council, and religious council with original shamanism using the Kaya language under a banner that was the Svatsiska magic sign, the emblem of the sun. After the war, the Kuna people decided to give up on this emblem that was connected to the Nazis. So I urge you to have a look at the text and read the text. You will see that any action is an engagement for others or has impacts on others. Any action, as we said this morning, reinforces the inherent instability of the earth. But also, there are constructions or built environments which aggravate the scenario. They go against what we expect, what we dream of when we think about architecture. All these narratives that we see today, the ones I read, the ones that are in the mouths of many authors and philosophers, to some extent ring a bell. They're telling us stories or new forms of harmonies will be possible. And in this text that I was reading about the Republic of Thule, what is highlighted is that there was harmony between nature and culture. But this harmony was a long struggle. It was not something taken for granted. These were things that had been built so that it was possible to arrive at this objective. So my question, the question that I think is essential, is that developing worlds and narratives is like thinking about systems which of course are tangible, that are technical and scientific, but that are very much symbolic as well, inasmuch as human beings can't live anywhere without symbols. Now, without further ado, Suzanne, I'd like to know what are your sources of motivation, your passions, and for our symposium, as you know, the question that we all share, and nobody has a solution, is to know how we're going to face risks. So architecture and philosophy dealing with risks, but also all the other disciplines can join us as well. Thank you, Chris Younes. Now I'll be sharing with you my research. What motivated me, you see, is, the title that chimed with my work, my research work, the most recent research, which was, let me give you the title, which is to confront risks or face risks. What really fascinated me when I looked at the theme is the different narratives developed by the architects at this crucial moment in time, and how architects are trying to reinvent a new world, and how they're trying not to disappear in nihilism or to be depressed, but on the contrary, they develop narratives and alternatives for new worlds. They redefine what progress might look like, and maybe that's another form of progress, which we're going to be looking at, that focuses on other sets of values. And all of these questions about nature, about society, about living together, about the ways we relate to others, and how we can reinstall these links and relations between people and nature, and also natural elements, and how, through the narratives, we can also come up with a new form of aesthetics, founded or grounded on other paradigms. So this is what I've tried to decipher, this paradigm shift through history. And I tried to look at the challenges at stake, why the paradigm was shifting, what the starting point was, what was the trigger point, or the type of crisis that led to these changes, and how architects tried to develop parallel worlds, alternative worlds, well, at least narratives of alternative worlds to emerge or re-emerge at other places, in other areas where no advance was possible, either a real physical crisis or an ontological crisis as well. Usually both go together. A crisis will trigger ontological crises. So where do we want to be in the world? How? In which manner? And how can we steer our boat differently in this world? This was my passion during my research work. What I'll be talking about this afternoon is a structure, which is an attempt at classifying the different narratives on the basis of the question of time and temporalities that are very important when there are moments of crises. The title of my presentation is Temporalities and Narratives of New Worlds. The root word for the word risque is something that comes from Arabic, risque, and cut in Latin, risicare. Apart from the physical dimension of cutting, for instance, a rock, which is a risk for vessels, is a cut in time, because risk can trigger a cut between what's before and what's after. This dimension can help us look at risks as an opportunity that can be seized, a turnaround point, and open up to new perspectives or outlooks. And the risks and the crises, that is, a judgment, a decision, an unraveling, an action of separating, create a cut in the timeline. At that moment, time is like suspended, and what we expect from the future changes. And this opens up a whole field of fictions that is such that we have to rethink how we relate to the world and time. Architects are looking then to reinvent new ways of living on Earth by restructuring towns, by challenging the links that exist between towns and the countryside, by reinventing cities and forms of living, architecture, and the materiality of architecture. And they invent as well new aesthetics. My proposal consists, therefore, in classifying the reactions of architects facing the crisis in 4 categories and connected to time and psychological conditions. These are categories of contraction and dilation of space-time connected to a specific way of action. Now, I have therefore 4 dimensions that are based on a time notion, because you can decelerate, accelerate, or suspend time to make projections into the past or the future. These figures that reappear in the contemporary world are aesthetic postures and psychic as well, and political, so that people can act at the turnaround point so as to reinvent the world. The first figure is that of archaism, leaping backwards in time and space, back to the earth so as to decelerate time, creation by destruction, acceleration of time as a salvation tool, and re-enchanting the world, suspending time so as to make far ahead projections in the future. then there are different moments of crises in history. We're going to look at these space and time actions. The interpreters are sorry, the speaker is reading a text. They will do their best. What we have to think about is all types of crises to come, economic, social, and health, for instance. Now, I'd like to talk very quickly about time, which I think is very important and pivotal for this type of action. The word temps in Latin tempus means a division of time, an era. It comes from the word tem in Indo-European root, in Greek temno, that is to remove something by cutting. So between time and temple, we have the same root, which, according to Catherine Malabou, means a way of separating from the natural world another space and a moment in a sacred way. Time and temple correspond to a delineated time that is done with an instrument. So cutting is an artificial action, and the cutting of time can help us grasp it, structure it, and represent time, as architecture will help you build space by cutting it and delineating it from the world. Thus, the project could be seen as a temple which would cut space so as to create parallel world. And therefore, what are the links that exist then with time and the world at a moment when these might collapse? These are the questions I started working on before I looked at the different chapters. The first figure, as I said before, is archaism, a leap backwards in space and time. By using archaism, the architects tried to change the current time, and they conjure up the arche, that is the prime principle of the world, an archetype, so as to open new futures. Chris Younes called that as a resource that was springing, and Philippe Potier as a place for the reinitialization of time and language. A leap backward will help you break away from the now and here. A faraway past can become the present. Another culture could replace our culture. So this is a fundamental challenging of a culture that is no longer compatible with the present time and our vision of the future.
These spatio-temporal operations introduce some countercurrents and are based on former cultures perceived as the cradle of Western humanity, as witnessed by the Egyptian decors after the French Revolution that have broken up with the culture of the former regime, as here the temple project, the freedom and public felicity of Durand, which was designed in 1793. This space-time leap can be carried out by a return to primitive nature anterior to what we call civilization. Strongly idealized and full of fantasies, it's a return to the original state, and this is done through the reactivation of natural elements, crude material and former forms. And here you have the exhibition, Architecture Without Architects, and the use of natural uses, Bernard Rudowski, a culture that would defend itself with fascism. And here we're trying to reinitialize culture. And they're starting where there was no Western culture, which led it to its own barbarian collapse. So real culture would be the one that would have not been impacted because it is understood through the term progress. The work of Hans Hollein illustrates another return to archaism. In the functionalist reconstruction after the war, you have the Aztec temples and space rockets. He wants to reinitialize space-time where the present still has to be determined. As his famous sentence shows it, today's architecture still does not exist, according to Hollenstein. Architecture today is coming back. Natural disasters because of climate change and the acceleration of urbanization has induced another relationship to nature, which is not here to be ordained and ennoblished by the modern man architect. I'm quoting Le Corbusier. We are aware of our fragility and mortality. This change in paradigm is also clear in the aesthetics. In Delhi, in China, Ishigali wanted to preserve nature by organizing 8 holiday homes around 8 megalithic blocks, which is a characteristic of the region, without removing them, but by integrating them in the architecture. Archaic because man is redetermined. He will settle between these rocks that determine his path, his daily rituals, his way of living in this space. He reactivates a primary, mainly physical relation, which is active and perceptible with nature in its crudest sense to ensure his survival, not the survival of man, just as we've seen now in the history, but in the story, but with the nature to save him from blinding and exponential urbanization. All these architects have introduced a cultural countercurrent, and they're trying to resonate with this world in crisis. The second figure is return to Earth, a way of slowing down time. This figure is to call for action, to slow down time, so that in terms of crisis, man can be part of this productive nature. To react to this progress, dynamism, with all its harmful consequences on the Earth, this will to slow down is to slow down this industrial era, to create a simpler way of living, more simple, more collective, and more human. It is Howard that proposes at the end of the 19th century a model opposed to this way of doing things, which led to a strong speculation, pollution, diving people in human life. The country is a necessary life not only for survival, but he also reinvents so that it might become a societal countermodel. He imagines a sort of ideal life in the country, which is different from the style of living in cities, and he sublimates the cities after the country through libraries, music, theaters, etc. Garden cities, the new societal temple outside of the cities, they have their own space, time, and they are ideally interconnected. They form a vast network that is based on a parallel circular economy, a cooperative one. They are self-managed and can create a societal nucleus, which are either regional, international, or regional. And it is an extensible meta-system, very generous in terms of space. The Garden City was adapted after World War I by numerous architects like Adolphe Loos, Bruno Taut, etc. The general poverty and the economic collapse after war has driven them to design an architecture which is reduced to its essential, with a strict minimum, especially Loos. And here, this project with the fountain and its obelisk, which marks the main square, is constructed by Hannes Meyer in 1919 by Freidorf. It's the idea of free money and free earth. He's a socialist anarchist at the end of the 19th century, and he presents himself as an alternative to capitalistic economy, which is highly speculative. In his example of garden cities, we will have a strong form to fight what is without form and what is represented by industrial cities. These garden cities are triangular in form, whereas Howard designed a circular town where each ring had its own characteristic, spatial and programmed. And there is a crown for the city, which is a real heart for the human community. After the war, Bruno Thal spent all his time to build this new dream city where you find the space-time in the Rufas near Berlin. You see this horseshoe form with a community area in the center. There's an artificial lake with gardens, with a line of trees, and where we also have horticulture. And you have this iconic central form, and this is an open palace for the people. So this is an idea he had during the war, and he actually built this after. And this tout is directly linked to his dreams, this utopia to fight against the depression post-war. And today, going back to the earth and the need to build a more resilient society by reconsidering the link between cities and country, this is absolutely topical because of the climate issues. But we still have to invent scenarios that would include the environmental aspects, economic ones, energy ones, and societal ones. Just as in the historical examples, it's not just a question of satisfying our primary needs, but to sublime them by thinking about all the cultural aspirations, aesthetical and spiritual ones, which are sources of joy and meaning. For the return to the earth, we cannot present contemporary examples that would be adequate. We have to inspire ourselves from ideas, from narratives that are of a new type, either through research, through practice, or through teachings. And I'm working on this right now with my doctorate students. The third figure is the creation through destruction, the acceleration of time as a salvation. The creation through destruction is an iconic figure because of its inherent violence, which is judged as necessary to carry out a radical change. The tabula rasa is the break with history, and it is primordial so that we can have time for new things. So as to quote Nietzsche, there is an acceleration, a progression, an entropy, and architects, that is the creation without destruction. They manipulate and cut time and space, first by destroying the former to create something new. And here in this destructive pulsion, which is very proactive, in the explosive manifestos of futurism, we have Maniretto, who is fascinated by the technique, etc., and he wants to remove time and space and history that he believes as being obsolete and static. Time and space have died yesterday. We live in the absolute because we have already created the eternal speed, which is omnipresent. After World War I, the words of Le Corbusier also witness about this eternal fascination for machinery and technique that he sacralizes, like Marinetti as a radio city. He writes about the flamboyant skyscrapers made of glass, and he moves away from this movement that he considers as perilous dynamite. His time is the time of acceleration. His temple is the radiant city, which is almost sacred. It is at the center of the Parisian historical center. In a proactive way, he tries to accelerate time to propose the new motorized human being in a radiant future, get him out of the crisis, the urban chaos, and social issues through the bias of destruction. And then the creation through destruction of ultra-liberalism with this environment and its crisis, which is still regulating the world. Here, we're trying to accelerate this further as the only means to come out of this crisis. This acceleration dynamism is expressed in the towers that are growing and coming out everywhere in the cities. The Homo sapiens wants expansion, to use the words of William Sturczyk, or in the concept of the smart city or cyber city. Unlike the green city, which is a deceleration, and that can be foreign in the previous figure, the smart city aims at a figure which is totally computerized, exploiting the information technology and communication technology based on the collection of mega data, so as to improve the quality of the urban life, the flows, the governance, and to optimize the management of resources and risk prevention. So those are smart cities. And so Taipei established in 2016 a smart city project where air vehicles without pilots could collect water from the city reservoirs. But data collection also has the risk of a violation of human rights and dependence on IT metasystems. And in case of crisis, these might break down, and cities would be less resilient as in the past once they are dependent on the metadata without being able to manage its proper functioning. And so it takes another meaning, and this might escape any control. I'm sorry, but the speaker is reading her text extremely fast, and the interpreter does not have the text. And so here we have to suspend time to project ourselves into the future, re-enchant the world. This is an optimistic figure which is based on pushing away the crisis, which is Freudian. The complexity of this figure resides in the dual temporal operation. First, suspending time to extract ourselves from here and now, then a projection into the future to offer a new future. The distancing, suspending time outside of time and outside of space, we can project ourselves in a state after the crisis that we're trying to enchant. Culture and society are at the heart of this figure. How can we contemplate the transmission of knowledge, of ideas and moral values after the collapse of a society? How can we foster books, art, communication and cultural interaction so as to avoid the risk of another collapse? So let's analyze the projects of cultural temples designed in times of crisis and whose goal is to re-enchant the world. After World War I, the Belgian philosopher Paul designed the world to commemorate the end of the conflict and celebrate the foundation of the future Society of Nations in Geneva. He starts with a deeper idea of all the cultures of all the countries and the creation of a common language of knowledge accessible to all, and he thinks that that would be a path towards peace. He invites Le Corbusier to develop a project that can give form to his ideas. The main points of this composition that we see here is the World Museum, and the master of modern movement proposes a square ziggurat with 7 stories towards the sky, going up towards the sky, a sort of Babel tower, and raised through piles. So it's an evolutive form of a project and an optimistic vision which is based on World War II. All the values, progress, morality, culture, technology are radically questioned here. After the war, we had to build a new world based on other paradigms. The fascination for cybernetics and the emerging IT techniques. So with John Littlewood, we see it. With Archie Graham, we see a reorganization of the world based on nomadism, where man, the computer, would join the archaic, like a rock plaque of David Green, with vision of the nature which is crystallized in the figures of the electric and the aborigines. The archaic comes back in different forms in the Teshima Museum, designed by Nishizawa and the artist Naito. And they substitute art with nature. There's no more culture. There are no more techniques, no more progress, just the awareness of time as a source of creation. The archaic reappears here. It is at the antipodes of limited growth, and it is responsible for the economic crisis. and gives birth to primordial experience that radically question the present and the future. So therefore, we've gone from the concept of unlimited growth to an archaic posture, which is based in our faith in nature versus culture. So time is then suspended, just as Montremol, the soft watches of Dali. We have this suspension. We are led by these narratives that open to real or imaginary perspectives, operational or visionary, that are modifying our expectations in the future. When we analyze the current trends and when we look at the historical perspective, I like to encourage the creation of new ideas, of new model projects, of fictions, because the end of everything, to use the words of Kant, is definitely not going to happen tomorrow, although it is coming closer. Instead of panicking or to end up in nihilism, Pierre-Henri Castel invites us to be in the present and in the near future. If we want to be happy, we don't have much time left. It's a way of presenting tomorrow or the day after as the only opportunity to realize what is dear to us. So therefore, we need to have a certain vision for action. When time suspends its flight, as René Latour said it during the COVID crisis, if everything is stopped, everything can be questioned, changed, selected, sorted, interrupted for good, or accelerated. And it is in this perspective that we can invent new narratives for new spaces so that we can act considering the risks. So let's think about the role of architecture and urbanization in this real issue at stake in contemporary world, because this desire for progress has led us about thinking about the future, and this might definitely stop us sooner or later. Thank you. Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you this afternoon. So what is making me angry first? What makes me angry? It's a way of how people think about environmental architecture by boiling it down just to the climate change, by thinking that it's just a greenhouse effect or carbon footprint or power issue. Because here we're going, I mean, whether it's with high-tech solutions or not, and we've seen it here with the smart cities, but this is also true for the low-tech solutions. Apart from this claim of trying to be frugal, these two options make me really angry, really upset me, because this is besides the whole political aspect of the environment, social environment. We're talking about Illich, Gors, Pushkin, and it is besides the question of the living. And what motivates me is to put all these three dimensions together. And the architect is the best person here, because he or she always acts on what already exists. That's the best person to hold these three dimensions, because I'm fundamentally convinced that to fight for a habitat that is dignified and accessible to the poorest, fighting for the non-human living, it's one and single thing, it's one and single fight. And in the architectural solution, we can think about this and do something about this. So I'm going to time myself because I've written 13 pages and it's a lot. I won't be able to go through these 13 pages. So some people underline this. The Anthropocene is probably the last narcissistic wound that has made the humanity fall off its pedestal. After Copernicus, that thought that the world was at the center of the universe, when we talked about human beings being the same as animals, psychoanalysis with Freud, the Anthropocene reminds us that humanity behaves since a certain time as a parasite of the biosphere. Among all the factors contributing to the loss of our centralness, architecture has probably played a major role, although it was unexpected. The discipline that felt that it was an art of constructing to confine man, his place, has done it at the expense of the others and in fine at his own expense. Our ways, which are based on extracting the exploitation of non-renewable material, artificializing soils, and intensive urbanization, constitute today an art of digging one's own grave, or it is common grave in which we are all thrown in. Confronted to climate change, the massive endangerment of species, forced migration, there are a lot of people who legitimately are still fighting to get a place in the world which is not guaranteed. Insecurity is a shared horizon, including for us, and we believe that we are protected from that. So there's a lot of food for thought here, not as what Marielle Massé says, to take one's place where it wouldn't embarrass anybody else, but to accuse this world of this place taken, refused, or to be taken. It is urgent to come out of this anthropocentric vision of the habitat and rethink our position in the sphere. We're talking about ethics, the care ethics, and I would like to criticize this idea of the human exception of habitat, to deign the non-human to be able to cohabit the earth. And then I'd like to propose an approach that I would like to formulate now. Living is not claiming a place as being one's own, but we have to share the space with the entire bioethic community, and this is characterized by its interdependence and its vulnerability. And in order to do so, I think it is indispensable to go back to the concept of vulnerability, which is used in social and political theories, which are in competition with each other, that of the risk and that of care. So I'll begin with the risk. Ulrich Beck described this risk society stemming from the latest industrial developments of the 19th century. What he shows that it is essentially turned towards the production of wealth, and it is faced with all the social issues because there's an unequal distribution between individuals, but it is also faced with all the environmental dangers related to the modes of exploitation of all the resources. According to him, the society is becoming reflexive because of its ability to manage what threatens it. That is the risk it has led to because of the modernization process. And one of the specificities of this type of society is that it is only related to itself because it believes that it is not, that there's nothing outside of it that can threaten it. Society has no more externality. The risks are mainly social. The environmental problems are technical issues. Nature is an artifact. The feminist philosopher Jean Prompto, in a short article called The Risk or Care, accuses the risk theory to be based on a gender theory which overvalues masculine theories of control, mastery, and power along the lines of colonial strategies of the northern countries. Toronto, unfortunately, does not develop these arguments that are very abstract, but she rightly points this exclusively social concept of vulnerability in this risk theory. This is related to a form of fragility or weakness that we need to come out of. Vulnerability is an inability at a given time to anticipate risks and to face them if they ever came true. Today, we hear this type of discourse in some uses in the policymaking idea of of resilience. To be resilient is to be able to come out of a situation of vulnerability. This vision is based on an anthropology of the capable man, or a trust in the resources of a system so that one can rebound. Tronto criticized this vision first by showing that this notion of risk didn't have an operatory character because of the recurrence of the scale and the magnitude of the disasters to which we are exposed. And we see today risk stems from the capitalism of the 19th century and doesn't work when states like California cannot guarantee anything because there are so many disasters. But it also showed that if we suppose that resilience, unlike vulnerability, if it reiterates an ideal of autonomy, and that is totally fallacious. And this care ethics will try to answer that issue. As you might know, the care ethics originated in a study published by Carol Gilligan in 1962, which is called Une voie différente, which highlights that the moral decision criteria are not the same among men and women. The latter foster interpersonal relations rather than abstract calculation rationales. I don't have the time to develop all this. I've already spoken for 7 minutes. And she tries to establish a new moral paradigm, which is that of the care, which is as a priority the relations with the other and the fact that we have to care for each other. And John Tronto will try to give care its widest extension in a book in 1992, which is called in French, Un monde vulnérable. This is how she determines care. It is activity characteristic of the human species that cover all that we do so as to maintain, perpetuate, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. This will include our bodies, our people, and our environment, all that we're trying to link up in a complex network of support to life. And care is presented by Tronto not as an activity. I mean, it's an activity that is socially recognized and instituted, and it involves investment, attention, but also skills. We also talk about the work of care in the United States. It means a certain class, gender and racial issues, to use the American term. All the care jobs, well, they're mainly carried out by Afro-American women or Hispanic women with very low salaries. But care is also a disposition, condition shared by all living beings, because life in its essence is vulnerable. We're all vulnerable. We all depend on each other.
So, to live is to experience vulnerability. If we used Heidegger's words, and this is one of the main influences for Tronto, is that to be present on the earth as a human being is to know that you are and will remain vulnerable. Now, there's a criticism of the abstract individual in the a person who is far away from the feelings, his or her gender and dependencies. On the contrary, if we say that vulnerability is an anthropological invariant, not a bump on the road, means that we can give up on the idea of control and total power, but also in saying that care is a responsibility structured on how we relate to others, either human beings or not human beings. This new linkage between vulnerability, responsibility, and care has recently pushed her to come up with a new approach. I'll quote, "Rather than considering buildings as things and to think about them as links with the environment, people, fauna and flora that exist over time and in space, we need an architecture that meets the fundamental task to share responsibilities so that we can care about our world, an architecture that's sensitive to the repair values, preservation, and also to keep all forms of life on Earth. The interpreters will do their best. The text is read at full speed. So, there's a refusal of some ideas, recognition of places that are inhabited, and the value of non-human and also human living beings. This ecological approach to care is a link to North American environmental ethics, and more particularly Aldo Leopold's ideas expressed in his Almanac of Account of Sounds in 1949, in which we can find that in care there are characteristics of Aldo Leopold's, that is, his relational vision and also the importance he gave to feelings. The word biotic community that he used, that people didn't like and reproached him with, saying that it was better to talk about an ecosystem or the linkages between the living, well, this expression means that individuals, human individuals, are members in groups that are interdependent, individuals that are close to each other, to which they are emotionally linked. What Leopold urges to do is to focus on the integrity and the beauty of the biotic community, and it implies very specifically the fact that we are not in an abstract ethics of rights, but rather responsibility, consideration, and engagement in a living environment which is shared. And more precisely, to come back to the notion of architecture, Toronto, just like Leopold, was not thinking about the interdependencies as a set of linkages in a given context, as the relations between the objects, for instance, or the artifacts that are built artifacts, but in an environment, in a milieu, a social milieu, also the biotic, because she mentions plants and animals which help and perpetuate life. Catherine Larère, a philosopher, also underscored what puts together and also separates the care ethics from environmental ethics and the opposition between care and wilderness, a North American concept that is connected to the wilderness. In the wilderness, as she says, most relations are based on competition or on predators. Now, for human beings, this would mean they would fit in this relations-based system. In the environmental ethics, the standard is that of non-intervention. We can have a form of respect or admiration, but no care, that is, no active care. I think that this criticism has good grounds, but we should bring in more nuances. The environmental ethics from Leopold is not exactly Leopold's ideas. I don't think we can say that one equals the other, and also because wilderness is a very problematic issue that is connected to a pristine nature that's totally mythical, that doesn't take into account the colonization of Europeans in North America, and also it implies a non-relation thinking that usually means the sanctuarization of the wilderness, as if humans and non-humans couldn't cohabitate. What's really good about the care approach is that we think how we relate to the living in a daily way. The nature that we're faced with is not that of the tundra or the steppe. We're not living here, or rather, we're living with pigeons and rats here, rather than with eagles or wolves. So how could we relate to these wild animals? How could we have linkages and links to rethink how we live? Well, the care ethics, and that's what's interesting in the care ethics, it means that we have to rethink in terms of linkages and not what's torn away in relations and not in delegation of responsibilities. However, I think that the care ethics and the notion of care as is looked at today is still a problem. It's unidirectional, asymmetric, and anthropocentric. Now, in simpler words, it means that in the care ethics, we, the human beings, care for others. We, the human beings, repair things. We could therefore think about this and say that maybe there's a materialistic echo in that, which is better than an authoritarian approach, yet an echo which still resonates and which is such that we are at the center of the living world and above the living world. Maybe we're not yet ready to give our position away to others. So how can we give to the living environment its fully fledged role? We should reverse the definition of the care ethics, not to think about it as a care relation, but about caring for the relations. What we have to care for is not others, but the relations we have to others. That is, the links we have with others, either humans or non-humans, which implies no asymmetry, no hierarchical structure in the living environment. Thus, we would make sure that the care ethics and the environmental ethics would be compatible, theoretically, which is no small thing, but also to strengthen the interdependencies that exist and to think about new ways of cohabitating. Now, what does that mean? To care for the relations. We are in charge of architecture. How would we build and inhabit our places differently? I'll give you one view. Of course, there are different entry points, but I'll choose the idea of natural resources as an entry point. As you know, in the past 30 years, architects have been realizing fully how their activities have impact on the biosphere. And thus, the architects have decided to consider a number of changes. To start with, they don't want to use fossil fuels and they turn to renewables. They've changed the non-renewable raw materials and commodities to the benefit of materials coming from the biomass. And of course, the objective is to reduce the consumption of resources in general. Now, these approaches are very important, but, and that's my point, I'd like to insist on that, they still think about the world as an inventory of natural resources that we can tap from. Rather than using them, we should care for them and preserve them. Today, what we're saying is that we have to care about these natural resources. So the question, I think, is not just to conjure up a more responsible approach to the use of natural resources, but to radically challenge this notion, which is only a social construct. Resources don't exist out of the blue. They are always the result of how we relate to a given environment. And the way we perceive resources in our culture, that is the extractive-based culture, is based on a very special link, which simultaneously consists in enrolling the non-human beings so that they would reproduce an environment where resources only have an economic value, and at the same time by saying that they have no agency role and therefore no rights. So to talk about natural resources really shows that we are not in a position to relate to the world other than to think about the world as something that we own. This is an oxymoron, that is natural resources, as geographer Claude Raffestin was saying. And what does that mean? Well, the only thing it means is that we want to naturalize modes of operations of raw materials in the earth that should be the common good. So as to go away from this notion, which is deleterious to resources, we have to stop using the natural resources of the earth, but also we have to pay attention to the fact that each living being represents in a very specific way the resources they depend from. What we usually qualify as resources is never just resources for human beings. These resources are shared by other human beings, or other beings rather. Timber comes from trees. They have their own lives, and these trees are a resource as well for other living forms, like the birds that nest in the trees, the mushrooms that grow on the trees, or other parasites on the bark, or the leaves or other insects as well. And of course, a tree is a resource for the other trees as well, with which it's going to communicate. Resources are the common good, the result of specific linkages that are the fabric of the living. As Anthing is saying, the development of worlds is not just in the hands of human beings. All living things will develop their own inhabitants without destroying the earth, the water, and the air. Without this possibility of resettlement, this species would disappear. And thus, each living entity has the power to change the world for others. So human beings are not the only ones to use resources to be able to live somewhere or to inhabit someplace. All living beings inhabit and live in some type of cooperation or competition to produce the place that they inhabit. There are rivalries in case of scarce resources, but that's true for human beings as well as for non-human beings. The eco-feminist Waldbloemut also underscored that our refusal to recognize the contribution of the non-humans to our very existence encourages us to deprive them from their resources. So back to our own concern, that is architecture. I have the impression that if we say that wood construction is really good because it's going to protect the environment, well, this doesn't really make much sense if it leads to looking at trees only as resources available that we can use, rather than saying that trees are living things that have their own resources as well, and the trees also cohabit the earth. Well, mark my words, I am not saying that architects have no right to qualify trees or timber or wood as a biosource material, nor can we say that we shouldn't chop wood or build something made out of wood or timber. This is not my point, but I think we should ask ourselves again the question, which is, what about the way we look at things? Why do we want to take ownership of all the other living beings, the non-human ones? And what matters is not how human beings adapt to the different environments, but where we fit with other beings, because together we can weave different fabrics of life. If we look at resources as being multi-specific links, rather than saying we have resources that we can own, would be to recognize that resources are shared by humans and non-humans. Baptiste de Morisot, a philosopher, also said that the existing ecological crisis is the crisis of how we relate to the living environment. And he used Philippe Descolas' approach, the anthropologist, who defined ecology first and foremost as an ecology of relations. So if we recognize how important these relations are, thanks to which we can inhabit the earth, then we can perhaps think in terms of a reciprocal approach with the living environment. That is, we would then consider that there are different ways of inhabiting the earth, and therefore we would look at a dialogue or a better trade-off so as to have a better sharing of space. Our architecture should no longer just be something that's anthropocentric and should open up to something that's more ecocentric, and we should pay more attention to the living forms that live with us, either human or non-human, by considering them all as actors to defend a viable and fair world. But how could this fundamental idea be translated into our construction projects? Well, first and foremost, we should stop and consider that architecture is solely for human beings. Our buildings can be designed as places where we live, but for other forms as well of life, animals and plants, as far as public spaces are concerned, and this also includes our cities and towns. Usually there are other living forms, humans and non-humans, with which or whom we cohabitate, more or less. So I think we should not just look at architectural discipline as a narrative, which means that we have to be protected from the external world. How long will this last? Why do we want to go back to Adam's time, or Prometheus, that was marked by technology that makes a difference between human beings and the animal realm? Why couldn't we look at another narrative for architecture that would no longer be based on the fact that we need a shelter, but on the fact that we want to open up? And this, as you will see, is a link between this project and the other project of open shelters, to open up to climates, to seasons, other living forms that we've turned a blind eye on. The horizon for architecture is to become such an opening system, thanks to which we would be able to grow and nurture relations, to be with others, and to give them enough space, or more precisely, to give them their original space, which would be the first step so that we can think about the way we cohabitate together. Thank you very much for your attention. The interpreters are sorry, they did their best. This is a text that was read at full speed, and the interpreters didn't have the text before. Good afternoon, I'm Marjorie Sales. I'm a landscape gardener. I've been working at BAS for more than 10 years. And what are the reasons? Why are we here today? Well, that's not an easy question, you see, but in a nutshell, I would say that if you look at all of our projects, what we try and do is that we try and always anticipate risks to come, the risks that are very much connected to climate change. So in the agence BAS, we all feel that we have a role to play, that we have to think that way. Hélène? Well, let me pick on what you've said to start our presentation. As Chris Younes said, we are a landscape gardener agency, more than architects. The founding members come from the École des Paysages from Versailles. I'm an architect myself. We work with architects, town planners, landscape planners and gardeners. We have 3 agencies in France, in Paris, Lyon and Bordeaux. And we worked with you before. Au tournant de l'expérience, a symposium organized in 2016. We're very happy to be with you again. Thank you for coming as well. Thank you very much. And, well, what we do is that we try and answer the question as well. The question is about the territory. And we thought, how can we deliver this presentation today? We thought there's research and action, the 2 pillars of our agence. I'm Hélène Kosodia, I'm an architect, and I come from the Gerfaux laboratory. I'm in charge of the editorial unit with my bosses and the project leaders at the agency. I asked Marjorie also to come because she has an operational, hands-on and empirical view on risks. The interesting thing, as you can see here, is that this is going to show you how we work in our Agence BAS. So the foundations, the projects, the narrative, the figures, the words you're using. We worked with fundamentals, narratives, and we have very iterative approaches for our projects in our agence, between the narratives, the discourse and the imaginary, and the projects that we hatch in our agency. We'll start with the projects. Well, we have a whole series of projects connected to risks of floods, soil pollution, but also bodies in space, because we work also for sports centers. This is what we do in our agency. And today we decided that we would focus on 2 case studies and 1 major case study presented by Marjorie that are connected to the risk of flooding. And this is the park of Prairie Saint-Martin, and then we'll be talking at the Tréport between Picardy and Normandy. And finally, a project called the Troisième Correction du Rhone River. The word correction for a river is a very interesting word. It's a word that we've taken from other people.
Pour parler rapidement, je vais changer pour regarder l'écran. On a mis cette situation de ce philosophe irlandais.
So we'll start with this, an Irishman. He published in the 18th century, Burke Edmund, this quote on the subliminal. Anything that can trigger ideas of pain and danger can create the highest level of emotions for the human mind. Why is this something interesting for us? Well, we've realized that the question of risk is interesting because there's always something sublime in what we do. And this triggers collectively shared emotions. This federates several stakeholders. We amplify how we relate to the environment. And to conclude, we can look at other narratives for human settlements and installations. We've decided to develop a concept that Marjorie is going to describe, which is that of geo-narratives. These are narratives that are based on the geography where our projects are, the anthropic forces that exist. It's the metrics that we use so that we make sense and buy into the territories. These geo-narratives are the crossing points between the natural forces and the human beings. The question is, how can these anthropic natural sources become a source of inspiration for our projects? And as you will see, in doing that, we'll talk more about immersion values, we'll use the cycles of nature, we will turn constraints into something positive, and also we'll federate the different players on the project so that we federate a given vision on our territories. As we said this morning, we are landscape planners and gardeners, so the way we relate with the living environment is very dynamic, and we can reduce the level of risks, because what we want is to have good links between human beings and their environment, but also to use a new time and space approach to urban projects and to work differently with the living environment. Therefore, we've changed our definition today. We're no longer in wilderness. On the contrary, we're focusing on the caring we could give to relations, because we look at the living environment in a dynamic way. But also to us, a landscape is a place where people live. It's not a postcard, which is what you would see if you look at classic definitions of the landscape, which means that as far as our methodology is concerned, we work more, for instance, on processes. These are some examples. This is a park, almost 30 hectares, and then we'll look at a resilience study for La Brelle, and then we'll look at another vast project presented by Marjorie, 31,000 or more hectares. That is 1,000 times bigger than what we can see in the Prairie Saint-Martin. The interpreters are doing their best. The speaker's reading at full speed. So, what about human settlements? Well, for us, we have definitions for resilience. It's a changing territory that can anticipate major turnarounds and changes to remediate or to reduce the effects on the environment. And the objective is to move to a more dynamic status so as to preserve the initial features, a status that will have to be decided collectively and built collectively. We want to provide technical solutions, but also we want to improve awareness of risks. By staging things, we think about spaces to welcome water without having negative impacts on the urban environment. But also, we want to go back to a normal situation at the end of these events. So we can identify the major urban systems connected to water, like to contain, to control, to store, and to absorb. This is the example of Les Prairies Saint-Martin, a park which is to the north of the Rhone River. These were gardens of workers. They were usually flooded by the river, which is close to the town of Rennes in Brittany. So as to find a solution against this risk of flooding in the region, if you look at the park, well, it is very much based on water and where water would flow and what would happen when there were major floods in the region. So we thought this is a natural hydraulic park that could work with sluices, for instance, and other systems. And this environment is a damp environment, which was the basis for us to think about the very design of this park. We have a park that's very urban to the west along the canal, along the island, and there's more wilderness, if you will, to the east of the park. With that, and that's interesting, I think, even philosophically, and even though, of course, we don't say that this is philosophy, but at least we can look at the natural gradients connected to the dampness of the site, which means that we go from species that are very dry or very humid, domesticated species or wild species, and therefore there's a nice transition between nature and the city. These are photos taken from drones. This is how the site changes over the seasons. What's interesting is that we want new uses on the park and new narratives as well. These are children we met in the park. They were about to build some type of construction on one of the islands on the river, some type of hut that was well hidden. They were building a new realm, if you will, of their own. And now another scale of a project. This is a study of resilience connected to marine submersion. This is the estuary of La Brelle, which is well known because there's chalk cliffs close to Mers-les-Bains and Tréport. These two towns are in between Haute-Normandie and Picardy. The site is really splendid, and the landscape is very much connected to the presence of water in the area. It's an ever-changing territory.
And what you need to know in this resilience study is that we have 3 scopes. It's a holistic approach. There's an action located in the seafront, the security of the rocks. There's another area that is the project in blue, the center of Mers-les-Bains. There we're going to try to work on how we can direct the water flows in the water center and requalify new public spaces. And we have another wider area, which is closer to the estuary. And here we can think about a wider scale until the historical city that is further down inland. And so therefore, we're going to see that these accumulated risks, there is a whole number of risks on the territory: marine submersion, the runoff of the waters from the hillocks, the costs related to La Brelle and the water level going up, and the rising of the table waters. And all these factors will create new floods on this territory. And so we know that through the presence of this risk, there are floods that have been existing there for more than 100 years. Now, very quickly, there's a graphic tool that we've tested at the agency, but it's not very exhaustive. We've tried to represent the natural forces related to the anthropic forces, and we wanted to have in one single object, which is not really readable. You can't really read it on the screen. You have the natural forces and the anthropic forces, and see how the resilience study can deal with the vernacular, the landscape, and we wanted to develop a study. We wanted to find solutions with the existing vernacular or the archaism of the site, if we may call it like that. And you can see that when we compare the 18th century maps of this estuary, the channels, the position of the estuary, and we can better meet risk management. If you just compare the maps, you have to understand how these forces took place for several centuries, and in this way we can identify some strategic areas. And here, this is the prairie area, which is an area where we have events with a mini golf, a sports, a leisure area, a market, and we try to have waters here because we knew that we had the space and we could restore the nature in that area. So to talk about this risk, we're going to reconfigure new areas. We're going to work on the soil. We're going to work on the humidity in the soil, while bearing in mind that risk management means that we'll have to have a risk culture management on this territory. I'm going to give the floor now to Marjorie, who's going to present the third correction on the Rhone River. Hello again. So I'm going to talk about this third correction of the Rhone, a major territorial project. And in just a few slides, in very short time, I'm going to tell you about this. So it's a major challenge, but I'll try to do this together with you. So now let's do this large project. I'm going to talk about the vision that our landscapists had to try to find solutions to this project and to anticipate the future evolution. So we started first observing this territory, the Rhone Valley, therefore in Switzerland. So this project is huge, it's really vast, it's a unique project in Europe, and Helen talked about the surface area in her presentation. It represents 160 linear kilometers of rivers. It's a study that begins at the source of the Rhone, not exactly so, slightly downstream in a city called Glech, in the valley of German Switzerland, right up to the Lehman Lake. We cross two cantons, the Du Valais canton and the Vaud canton, when you arrive close to the lake on the right bank of the Rhone River. So you cross a territory, very specific landscape with the Alps, mountain and pre-Alpine mountains. Now, for this project, we were not alone. There was a lot of work to be carried out, so we set up a multidisciplinary team that you can see here on the screen. And so we set up 3 poles. So 3 centers of reflection. One on architecture, urbanization, another one on the geography, mapping, the design, and a more technical center on the roads, the networks, environmental engineering, and the environment. So the Rhone Valley, what does it look like? I'm going to show it to you. So this valley, there are all kinds of very diversified landscape, and this is very important for us at the agency to use this basis, these foundations, and to see what kind of landscapes we have and to know what we're going to work upon. So that's what we always do in our studies. We make a morphological, geographical, environmental, architectural. We look at the heritage. We first set up these foundations, and then we can know about the landscape and know about this unique territory. So the landscape, we begin with the lake, the Lehman Lake. And so you see it is a rather farming land, which is very wide. Sometimes the landscape is guided by the geology. Here, this is a very particular section, which is the Rhone elbow. The Rhone could not pursue its road straight by eroding the rocks across it, because the rocks were too hard, and therefore it made a 90-degree turn to find softer rocks and pursue its path right up to the lake. Now, you don't just have natural sections, you also have sections that are highly urbanized areas. And it goes up gradually right up to the source of the river. And here you have land which is increasingly natural, with valleys which becomes narrower and narrower. And you land up with something which is very narrow until the white spot that you can see between the mountains. That is the glacier, that is the source of the Rhone River. So it is landscape with strong natural value. Here on this picture, you can see a picture of the woods. This is the Finge woods, which is a very important environmental reservation, which is very important in this territory. And you can see it here on this map from Napoleon. Here you can see the natural aspects of this valley, and the Rhone has a major role to play here. You can see the zigzaggings, you can see the wooded area in the north, and that is the Finge forest I was talking about. And so it is a valley, which is an anthropic valley. So the whole natural side, this is a sublime landscape. Helen talked about that. She talked about the natural aspects, the vertical aspect, and this is a highly anthropic valley. A valley which is between two slopes, and you have motorways and railways which are highly developed. And this valley is highly developed economically, and the natural resources are highly exploited. I have trouble saying so because of the previous presentation, but this is what you have. You have natural resources, gravel quarries, natural quarries, high industrial development with the development of a chemical industry, and the last industrial development, which is farming, with the farming of all this land that has become more fertile with the presence of the Rhone River, and you have a lot of fruit trees and orchards. So you see, it's all man-made. The Rhone Valley has been subjected to several corrections. A correction is a way to correct the river to stop it from overflowing and flooding the valley. So that's what we would say at the time. So the river went through several corrections. So one first correction in 1860s, it was a question of safety then. Then there was a second correction to which we added an economic value. And the third correction of the Rhone River, it has a new value here, and that is the environmental renewal. So I've given you a few pictures here of the floods in this area. There was a major flood in the years 2000, and here you can see a few maps of this area, the risk areas, the potential flooding risks before correction. So you have the red, blue, and yellow risks. But you see, it's a vast area, and in this very section after correction, you see a strong reduction of all the areas that could be flooded. Now, this project, with the third correction of the Rhone, this is first and foremost a question of safety, based on the following economic factors. So correcting the Rhone will cost 3 billion Swiss francs versus 10 billion of compensation if ever there were any floods. So this is why they've decided to carry out this project. So now how are we going to correct things? So you can see it here in this before and later. And the idea here is to widen the course of the river by 1.5 times its current width. So it is not a simple gesture from a territorial point of view. Now here, this is a picture of one particular section that has already been corrected in the High Valley area near Liège. So I don't have a beam to show you, but upstream you can see the correction. You can see it anyway, I'm sure. So upstream you can see that the river is very narrow, and then you see the part that's been corrected, and you can see that the surface has doubled. Now, the question we had is, how can this project, this engineering project, the risk correction, how can we base ourselves, or how can we divert this project so that we can create a large territorial project that would have meaning for all the living beings in the valley, all the living creatures, not only human beings. So how can we have a project, a landscaping that would give meaning to all the lives, all the living creatures? And this means we would need to have a landscape that would bear 3 values: a climate value, an environmental value, and a social value. So, in other words, how can we install on this very wide territorial project a geo-narrative so that there might be meaning over the 160 kilometers of this river? Now, to install this new world, to build this new territory, we've developed and we've worked to install a new common imaginary, as for example, the large American parks. And we've coupled that. This is the same picture as in Helen's slides. So how are we going to have a contemplative landscape? And by that we mean what our designers need to find in this type of territory. That means, how can we be humble enough in our intervention? Another important point to install our resilient landscape is to look at the time frame during which we're going to build this project. I'm not talking about the studies, but as for our work, the correction work, this will be done during an entire generation. It will take 20 to 25 years, and this is a huge amount of time. And to work with these constraints and to build our landscape, we've decided not to work on an urban composition project. We've decided to have a process that will take place in 3 parts. First, we're going to learn about the territory. We'll install our skeleton, our landscape skeleton, and then we will actually realize the project. Now, to create this landscape skeleton, we're going to look at the forces of the landscape. And here you can see all the tributaries of the Rhone River. And this will create a frame. The Rhone, this is a way of seeing the Rhone River. The Rhone River is not just in its linear movement, it's also in its cross movements, so 9,300 kilometers of tributaries. So we based ourselves on this existing framework so as to relate all the different landscapes that are crossed, and so that we can install a resilient landscape, and so we can anticipate the future risks related to climate change. Valais is the canton that will be mostly affected in Switzerland by climate change. And so all this will allow us to relate the different amenities and landscape nuggets, geological, architectural, environmental nuggets, all the different basins where we have life. All this will be connected with the help of this new landscape framework, and we will have a unique discourse around this framework. Now, I'm going to talk about this notion, now to root this notion, the construction of this new landscape. We've developed a certain number of tools, and actually at the agency we're still working on this, a tool called the Rhone Guiding Plan, which is disseminated at various scales. It is given to the players of the third correction of the Rhone, the engineering teams, hydraulic engineers, the structural engineers, and this is part of all the urbanization documents in Switzerland, which are equivalent to our PDIs and our SCOTs, and they're also given to the public at large thanks to itinerary mobile exhibitions that go to schools or to the different cities. So right now, this is the phase when we're trying to inform everybody about our study. So this guiding plan collects all that I've told you. It's a compendium of all that I've told you. And this framework is also explained, the methodology is explained. We have the creation of a Rhone territory, the whole Rhone array. So we have all kinds of parks that are connected with each other thanks to the Rhone River. And these various basins where there is life are connected with each other. There are different areas that we call the Rhone alleys, and you have little belts of freshness, as we call them, of greenery, and this is the whole cross-sectorial landscape with all the different tributaries, and this is completed with another system that we call the landscape roads, and in this way we can have a different view of the Rhone. So we have this Rhone guide plan. So we have several tools, and we can describe the future public areas that will be carried out through this third correction. So here you see a few pictures, and I will end my presentation with these two slides. Thank you very much. We're going to present the Atlas of Open Shelters. So after 10 years of teaching, this is what we came up with. And this was a question put by the student also. This atlas allowed us two things. So there's an exhibition and a projection of the site in the lounge. We also had an alumni, and we created this cohesion. And so therefore we could meet, all of us, all the people who were interested by these topics. And some are 10 years older than I am. And this experience allowed us to get in touch with each other. And we created the alumni of Open Shelters, which is a group for discussion. And this year we had a competition. And we're going to have this with the alumni next Monday morning. So this is the step aside. This is the production of the Open Shelter Atlas. So 51 projects from 100 graduates. The idea is not to provide a database that can be consulted by scrolling it, but there are themes to share these documents. So we wanted to focus on three major entries, either through the hazards and risks, then you have the geographies, the terrestrial addresses, and then you have the gestures and notions, the question regarding the imaginaries, so the notion of transformation. So when you reach the site, now as for risks and hazards, you have this diagram. And here we're showing the separation between the hazard, which is natural, and the risk, which is the encounter between a natural hazard and vulnerable human settlement. And so you see the red crosses appearing. These are the notions of risk. And we can navigate between these 50 projects. We can deal with them, broach them according to the risks. Now, regarding the geographies, the terrestrial addresses, each project, each risk, each hazard, each human settlement is dependent on the geology, the soils, the history of all the material extracted. So we thought that going through addresses would be very good. And then the gestures and notions. This is a proposal to show you the gestures, the actions, organize the hindsight, cross, etc., and notions. And this is a question of imaginary. And this dual thought on acting upon something and showing, so that we can have this third entry, which is a door to explore the atlas, which will be presented by Maxime Caillon. As Benjamin said, whether it is through the exhibition or the internet site, each of the project is classified. You have 3 entry points, either through hazards and risks. Here you have the risk of flooding or the raising of the waters. And here we have another project with the terrestrial addresses, Buenos Aires, Argentina, or the gestures and notions, cross, and then you have the engagement with nature. And these 3 combined entry points lead us to this project, the treatment of the hazard, the treatment of floods in the delta of the Tiber in Buenos Aires. So the students had studied the banks of the river. There were floods throughout the year here. And for each of these projects, we will have these 3 entry points. So these are the drawings presented. These won't be the images used on the site, but this is to show and present things clearly, these entry points. So here, on top, you have the hazard, the risks, the territorial addresses, and the gestures and notions. And at the bottom, every time, for those who are interested and want to go further, because with these drawings, it's just a summary, you have a QR code, and you can go into each of these projects on the internet site, and you can get into the sites where there are a lot more information. So we have a project in France on the Luabia region, the tsunami in Japan. There's another one on the earthquakes and landslides in La Paz, Bolivia, the risk of fires in Europe, and especially in Portugal. So through these 10 years of teaching, we have a diversity, whether it's in the hazards, the risks that are treated here, and the geographical areas covered. Because here we are in La Paz in Portugal, then we're in Montreal, Manila in the Philippines to deal with floods, the heat waves, and pollution, air pollution, which is another very important issue. And so this is a layout of the exhibition, and you can go and visit it. So half an hour. At the coffee break, you have the 51 PFEs, as we call them, and then if the Wi-Fi connection allows us, there will be interaction, and people who will discover this museum can also discover the internet site. And we've this little leaflets with the 3 entry points here: hazard, risks, terrestrial addresses, and the gestures and notions. And you have the QR code to have access to the internet site directly. And you have information on the chair and the PFE for those who are interested. And here I will let you, for those who do not have the time to see the exhibition or those who want to go deeper into all this, you have the internet address and the QR code for those who want to have access. And I'll rapidly conclude. We will project the site with my computer, so just be careful when you use it. But you can browse on the internet. Thank you.